It says push on it. Thank you. Now I don't have to speak as loud. I'm usually pretty loud, so sorry about that. Yeah, I haven't given a talk like this in 6 years. And why I talk like this, like a talk. I did give an unconference talk at PHP Tech a few months ago, and that was interesting and kind of a little bit messy and a little bit hard. And I've been working through a lot of stuff. Some of you might know that I did a series of talks called Open Sourcing Mental Illness for many years. And I'm going to kind of talk about what's going on with me a little bit in the, basically describe what has happened with me and how that maybe relates into mental health in the developer community, but mostly talk about my experiences, particularly in the last several years, in learning a lot about what I knew and how much I didn't know. So there's a few things to know. Not a warning exactly, but I'm probably gonna swear a lot. I tend to, and if that super bugs you, I'm gonna try to be cool about it, but I kind of swear a lot, so. And I'm getting old enough where I'm gonna do my best, but, and I'm probably gonna cry a little bit, and crying in public is a lot. It is a lot to handle sometimes. I don't know, we'll see how it goes. But if I start getting a little bit upset or something, help me out a little bit. Say, hey, Ed, maybe you're not a piece of shit. Maybe you're a good person, actually, a little bit. And, that sounds a little maybe crazy, but things are weird. And I'm going to need you to help me through this a little bit. I'm not the same person I was 5-6 years ago. I've got more stuff going on. I've got physical stuff and things like that, and it's hard sometimes for me. That's why I had to ask for a stool to be up here to make sure that I've got something to stand on or sit on in case I need to. So I want to thank you for getting up early to hear me cry, but hopefully, and yeah, this is pretty much about me, right? This is a talk really just about me and my experiences. So I think it's stuff that you're going to be able to relate to. I think it's stuff that you're going to find interesting. I hope so. But really, this is about me. And I do these talks because I need this stuff. I need this stuff in the world we live in. I need this because I can't get by without it. So that's part of why I'm doing this. So also, none of this constitutes medical advice. Please don't take it that way. I am doing my best to figure out what works and what doesn't work for me. And, that may or may not work for you. But I'm just going to talk about my experiences. So, yeah. So, we ready? All right, you got to yell. You're going to need it. All right, cool. A little bit of yelling. That's right. Yep, thank you. That was very fan servicey. I'm sorry about that. But, okay, so what are we going to talk about today? Oh wow, there's a cool ripple effect on that. That's awesome. That was not intentional. So the agenda today is kind of my experiences basically with ADHD and mental illness. That is, I think ADHD is the primary sort of thing that drives who I am and how I think and how I react to things and stuff like that. So I'm going to be talking a lot about that, about what I've learned about it so far. We're going to talk about some impedance mismatch and monkey patching and how we do that in our lives as people with ADHD to work around things. And then I'm going to be diving into anxiety, how anxiety works, how it kind of comes out of ADHD for me. But that anxiety, I think is something we can all relate to because anxiety is kind of a symptom of things. It could be a lot of stuff, right? It's kind of like saying I have a runny nose, I have anxiety. Yeah, well, a lot of things can cause that. But, so I think a lot of that, though, is applicable. We'll be able to talk about that. When life pours lemon juice in your eye, I'm going to talk a little bit about some tough times I had between 2017 and 2022. And some things I realized at the end where just dealing with the stuff, figuring out that it's not actually my fault that I'm this way, but it is something I have to take care of. It is something that's my responsibility. So the first thing we've got to talk about here, ADHD is a superpower, right? How many people here have just heard that phrase? Just raise your hand, just heard the phrase. Okay, every motherfucker who ever told you that is fucking lying. Okay? It is horseshit. It is so simplistic and so reductive that I've come to the point where I find it deeply offensive when people say that. It is not. It is not. I didn't put a ton of stats in here, but I can show you the stats of things that are expected of people throughout life who deal with ADHD, their rates of imprisonment, their rates of high school graduation, their rates of college graduation. Only 1 in 7 people with ADHD graduate college. It is significantly lower than the national average. Things like that. You are fighting for your life all the time with this stuff. And we'll get into why. Maybe you don't have to for everybody, but that's my experience. So, what is this stuff, right? So, can you guys read this okay? I know in the back it might be hard, but it's about as big as I can get. So, can you read it? I'm sorry. Okay, well, I'm going to do my best. We're going to post the slides later. This is what I've got to work with right now, so sorry about that. So, ADHD is a developmental impairment of the brain's self-management system, involving several different parts of the central nervous system. That sounds wide-ranging because it is wide-ranging, and because it is impactful on a basic fundamental level about how these brains work compared to how neurotypical persons' brains work. Primarily, these executive functions are affected. Focus, planning, memory, task management, things like that. And I'm not just talking about like, oh, when I'm doing a project or something like that. It is when you do everything, because your ability to function in those areas is affected all the time. Now, in certain situations, they don't. But if there's a strong personal interest or there's a perceived near-term danger, we find that folks with ADHD have actually very expected executive function. However, if they don't, they have extreme difficulty in developing sustaining motivation. And there's a guy, Dr. Russell Barkley, who has done a lot of research on ADHD, started studying it in 1989, was one of the earliest people to do significant research into the neurology of ADHD. And he calls it a motivation deficit disorder. It is not, I don't know what to do. It is not, I don't feel tension about what to do. It is not, I just can't figure it out. And it is not, I just chose not to do it. It is an inability to do those functions the same way that others people do. So just to make that clear. So stuff I notice about me, and again, I'll read it out loud. Sorry, it's probably a little, it's too hard to read. I'm sorry about that. But what I find is that I am either usually in a very highly aware state where I am like tracking everything that's going on, and I'm really kind of focused on stuff, and I'm sort of like in that now, or I am very oblivious. So a lot of that depends on context and the things that I experience with that. One of the things I find is that when I'm working on a certain kind of thing, and then I move to a different topic or a different area, something where maybe things work a little differently, the shift of that, and they find this with people with ADHD, their ability to shift context of like, well, this task requires a different kind of set of operations, maybe a different way of thinking about it than this task. The time it takes for their brain to basically switch that context is significantly slower. So because of that, you frequently get errors when people with ADHD are pushed into different contexts quickly. But one of the problems is that they also tend to push themselves into those contexts because we context switch really fast too in some ways. what I found is that perception of time modulates dramatically. So oftentimes I'll find that I was very unaware of how much time passed. It was like, wow, that was 3 hours, and I just plowed right through that. And then sometimes I'm achingly, aware of it, but I have a lot of difficulty sort of determining how long things take. And one of the things that I looked at is that perception of the future and perception of things that you would take action on in the future for planning. I found, this is something Dr. Barkley brought up, mentioned him before, and he talked about folks with ADHD, that even as they age out and some of the symptomology, especially the hyperactivity stuff, decreases, there's maybe whether that's age, whether that's just, it's kind of beaten out of them by society. But the short version is that what he found is that people with ADHD can never really see and prepare for things and perceive things as actionable more than about a week out. They just don't. And if you see other people, it's like 3 months it is. These people like me are not capable of doing it. So, okay, right, that's a thing that happens. And I talked about the motivation stuff and the extreme difficulty often in initiating actions. What I find is, I kind of talked about what they talked about before, that without a compelling reason for me to be interested, if I can't find something that interests me in it, or I'm scared enough to do something about it, it's very difficult for me to initiate activity. It just is. It just is. The way that activity would initiate for me is typically not intentional. It tends to be more reactive to what's going on. And one thing that happens to me a lot, and it's gotten a lot worse over the past few years, and I think a lot of that has to do with because I've been in a burnout state for about 2 years, is that frequently I'll get confused or juxtapose labels and values that might be an issue when you're a programmer. So you can imagine context stuff, like how certain things work in certain situations. Keeping track of things like this database does this, but this database does this, and this database, right, does it. So it is more difficult for me to keep track of that than the average person. I just can't keep track of as much stuff, it seems like. It's a little bit like if you have an experience like this, if you are programming a lot in one language, so let's say you're writing a lot of JavaScript, this happens to me all the time, writing JavaScript, and I switch back to something else, like Python, PHP, or something like that, and I'll write sort of JavaScript for a little bit, right? And I catch myself doing things that are syntactically, well, those are JavaScript things, they're not motifs in that. Well, that's because there's a residual part of the context in your brain that says that's what you're supposed to do, and you don't think about it because it's not cognitive. It's an automated process that your brain has developed over time, exercised, and turned into something that it's like a batch job. It just says, there you go, execute. That's what I do at the end of a line, right, every time. Well, now the context switch, it doesn't do that anymore. You don't want that, right? So you start writing some stuff and it's not syntactically correct in that syntax. Well, so you can probably imagine it's analogous to that, but it happens way, 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 way more. Way more, way more. So yeah. There's another aspect to it too. And actually this was a new name I heard of it called deficient emotional self-regulation. But generally it's about your brain's ability to regulate emotions and keep emotions in a range so that you can do stuff in life and participate in civilization and things like that. So for me, the problems inherent with ADHD folks in deficient emotional self-regulation, that's very, very common with folks with ADHD. This is the number one debilitating problem I have with my brain. This is not, by far, this is what hits me over and over again. And one of the things that kind of bugs me about it is I really run into this a lot with folks I talk to about ADHD, and it is not even mentioned once in the DSM diagnosis criteria. There is no mention of emotional dysregulation in it, not at all. And if you survey across, it's a major problem. And so I can't even see how far. So a paper that I quoted here, emotional dysregulation. So this is a paper, I think, from 2012, 2011. So after DSM-5 came out, emotional dysregulation is prevalent in ADHD throughout the lifespan, and it is a major contributor to impairment. Impairment is the inability to do things that you would normally do in life. So what it's saying is that emotional regulation, prevalent with everybody through their whole life, and is a major part of why they have, if you're talking about life outcomes, life expectancy, things like that, that it's generally lower for people with ADHD because it's harder. It's harder for them. There's also a lot of crossover between the executive function sort of circuitry of the brain, at least the parts that we understand seem to be active when you're doing that kind of stuff, and the emotional circuitry. So if there's issues that have to do with those systems, they're going to get impacted. That's a major thing. Again, doesn't seem to get discussed a lot with ADHD. How we feel deeply affects how we think. So what does this emotional dysregulation do to people with ADHD? Well, you tend to see it in three major areas: social interactions. You see a lot of people with difficulty in social situations, and a lot of it is due to, and I put in quotes, inappropriate emotional responses. Now I know I have those. So what does inappropriate mean? It means that it is out of the normal range of expected responses within the current environment. And that's all I can describe it as. It's not like, oh, they yell out, things or whatever, things that are taboo or what have you. But what I know is that I have emotional reactions that are significantly stronger than other people. I mask all of them because for the most part, I don't feel good about sharing it, and we'll get into, but generally a lot of people with ADHD learn that they have to suppress their emotions because they're continually interpreted as out of band and scary by the people around them. And so social shame keeps them masking it. There's a special kind of issue that you'll see come up with a lot of folks with ADHD called rejection-sensitive dysphoria, and I didn't know anything about it, hadn't heard of it until I read about it a couple of years ago, and I was like, oh yeah, that's happened my entire life. You have dysphoric reactions. Again, these are just reactions that are out of band, out of norm, seem like they're bigger than they should be, stronger than you'd expect them to be. So it tends to be, you'll have a dysphoric reaction to, again, perceived rejection. It is a matter of perception, not a matter of actuality, right? By an authority figure or a respected figure in your life. Your dad, your boss, your coach, folks like that. Those are folks that I've had major RSD stuff with, and I've had meltdowns with it and had to apologize to a lot of people because I was so embarrassed about how I acted. But I also, in that moment, it was like a flash fire. It just tore me up. And you figure out ways to try to keep it under control, but you can't, that still happens, right? That still happens. With folks with ADHD, what you tend to see is a high incidence of anxiety, depression, and mood disorders. About 50% of those with ADHD have an anxiety disorder. About 70% of ADHD adults will be treated for major depressive disorder sometime in their life. Other mood disorders, about 35%. About 20% of people with ADHD at least have the symptomology or could be diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Why? Because emotional dysregulation is a serious, severe part of ADHD, and that is part of the ADHD brain and how it works. And that's just something that happens. We'll kind of get into why. Narcolepsy and sleep disorders are very prevalent. About 50% of people with ADHD have restless leg syndrome. I have that where my legs shake like while I sleep, and they shake constantly. So it's one of those things where the idea that like your symptoms go away when you go to sleep, and that's not true. It doesn't happen. Your brain does not go to sleep. Your brain doesn't fundamentally do, it's not like, oh, it's in magic mode where you're just recharging. It doesn't work that way. So there's a lot of problems but also I think it's about half of people with narcolepsy also show symptomology of ADHD. There's a strong crossover between narcolepsy and ADHD, it seems, and that we think has something to do, or there's perhaps some related different things going on that have to do with severe fatigue and things like that a lot of people with ADHD experience, especially if they don't do certain things to like keep their diet, movement, things like that going on. It gets really hard. About 60% of those with ADHD have symptoms of autism, typically especially social anxiety and interaction issues. I absolutely do. There are certain things that I do that I'm like, boy, that's a weird thing that a habit that I do. And I've spoken with, I have a couple nieces and nephews who've been diagnosed as autistic. And I'm like, and I talked to my sister and about that, and she's like, yeah, that's something they do too. I mean, so it's not like, I don't know that it says, oh, yes, I'd be diagnosed with this. But what I'm saying is that some of the stuff that I deal with there's commonalities there. And sensory processing disorder. So about 50% of people with ADHD or sensory processing disorder also show symptoms of the other disorder. From childhood, loud noises scared the shit out of me. I've been scared of dogs most of my life. I learned to get used to them, but I was straight up terrified of dogs when I was a kid. The only reason I think is because they barked, and it just terrified me. And still to this day, a sharp, loud noise, it'll hit me like bam, and I'm immediately in fight or flight mode, immediately, right? And you're in the middle of that, and you're like, oh, no, we were just all hanging out, and somebody made a noise. And, like, I'm ready to, like, I might have to kill somebody or get out of here, right? And it's like, no, man, just chill out a little bit. Don't let them see. So it's like, he gets like that, right? But what we find is that in adult ADHD in particular, is the quote, comorbidity is the rule rather than the exception. People with ADHD typically have other disabilities or developmental disability, or they have some mental health concern that goes on in their life. It is very consistent. 85% of adults are diagnosed of individuals with attention deficit disorder, or ADHD. Approximately 85% of adults are diagnosed with at least one other psychiatric disorder or developmental disorder sometime during their lifetime. So that is almost everybody. And then I guess I'd talk a little bit about, and I've been talking 20 minutes here. Okay, getting to me. Growing up with ADHD was tough for me, and I'll share some stuff that's really from other people, but it's been very consistent with what my experience has been. I won't go too deep into lots. There's so much I could talk about with these things, and I could do a 3-hour tutorial on this, and it may not be that interesting. But the basic thing is that I found this, and I think lots and lots of folks with ADHD do this. I learned to control my behavior through self-shaming. It came from, and what I find is that most people with ADHD generally kind of feel like shit about themselves. They don't feel good. They don't feel good about what they've accomplished. They tend to be like the stuff they have accomplished, be like, oh, that was easy, because it kind of didn't feel like work. Anything that didn't feel like that, I'm like, oh, well, I did a fucking shitty job at that. I had to like convince myself to do stuff and do all these tricks like I'm some kind of kid. This is my internal voice coming out. So an interesting thing I read last night, self-esteem rises over time for most folks, I'd say neurotypical folks, and it peaks at about age 60. But what they find is that adults with ADHD, self-esteem tends to decline as they age. And there's some thought that what it is that it's a buildup of feeling like you failed again and again and again over time. Even though you kept going, even though you figured things out, you think, I didn't do enough, I didn't do it right, I didn't do it the right way. And a lot of that kind of comes from being a kid and dealing with this stuff. This is from an article, and there's links in here if you guys need it, I'll post those. A child with ADHD sees his parents' and teachers' displeasure with him, and he doesn't feel good enough. The child spends his early years trying to please and, independent of others' opinions, begins judging himself harshly. Sadly, a 3-year-old told me that he must be bad because people yelled at him all day long. 7- and 8-year-olds routinely tell me they are stupid, different, or a total failure. By the teen years, some kids continue to work hard for acceptance from teachers and parents, but others give up and feel like they will always be failures. And this is getting into some of the stuff from adults. I've not achieved enough in life, says one 43-year-old professional who enjoys a high income and is respected by his clients. I feel I could do more. I want to paint. I want to study languages. I don't want to watch junk TV anymore. I want to stop binge eating. And there's another one. I feel so dumb. I can never keep up with discussion, says Deborah, a woman in her early 50s with a bachelor's in science and zoology. People talk about politics and current affairs, and I have no head for those things. I try to remember facts and names from the newspaper, but they don't stick. I tune out when people talk to me. That's a person who doesn't feel like they're part of a community, doesn't feel, you can hear that, how different they feel internally. They've convinced themselves of this. Andrea, a 50-year-old woman diagnosed with ADHD, is eager to talk about her talents and strengths, but concludes, quote, "But those things come easy to me. That's just who I am. I don't have to work at them much. I mean, I'm not an accountant or a lawyer. That would really mean something to me." And that can be hard, especially you're thinking about, this isn't somebody who is just starting to figure out things in their life. These are people in their 50s, and they're fundamentally unhappy still. I know, I'm almost 50, and I'm kind of not really fundamentally happy either. These are my stories too. The habit of being self-critical often starts in childhood. A child with ADHD sees his parents and his pleasures. Oh, I already read this stuff. Oh, shoot, I'm sorry, I was repeating it, and copy and pasted it. God, don't relive all that shit. Oh my God. Very sorry. Oh. Sorry about that, man. I'm quick with these notes. I copied them too fast. So let's get into some of the things that we do. So one of the things you do, sometimes I think about ADHD is it's the impedance mismatch, and there isn't a problem, and I read a good article about this, I have to find it, I can't. There is not a problem with the ADHD brain in terms of how it functions. It functions well internally to itself. It just works differently than most other brains. However, the civilization we live in, society we live in, was not built for and not optimized for people with our brains. Maybe there were roles in the past. I've heard weird, completely speculative archaeological stuff about things like that. Is some evidence that maybe early hominids had a higher incidence rate of ADHD, perhaps because it might have been evolutionarily advantageous, but let me tell you, it's not advantageous now. Society basically wasn't optimized for people like us, but it was optimized for people whose brains work kind of like the average. So we have to try to map society to the way our brain works, kind of like an ORM or an ETL system. How many people here are man, ORMs are fucking awesome. Love ORMs. What do we always say about that? ORMs all suck, but we still use them. I use them all the time. But yeah, there's still all these things and stuff that's weird about it, and they don't really work right. And you try to do this, and it's all busted up, and it's like, shit, that didn't do what I thought I was going to do. Well, it's pretty much like that. And these ORMs and ETLs, they introduce a lot of overhead. It's a lot of work to keep up with this shit. Like, in fact, especially for people who literally do not have certain kinds of functionality in their brain that's expected of people by society, we do our best internally to work around it, but there are hard limits for everybody. I do think, and I think this is kind of in general, I think we all create a model of the universe in our mind, and I'm not going to get too deep on this, but I kind of think we all sort of have an ORM in our head, and what we interact with is not the universe, but we interact with the ORM in our head. We all translate a lot of stuff, but we have to translate more stuff because the things that are communicated to us, sometimes they don't come to us the same way, like the translation process doesn't work so good. There's also like some things that we can't do, or society kind of relies on us, and we have to hack either ourselves, our environment to compensate for that. Now, we're pretty good usually on thinking on our feet, but there's 4 kind of major areas that folks with ADHD generally get treatment nowadays. Now, I will say the belief is that most people with ADHD receive no treatment and don't seek out treatment. Numbers I've seen is that they believe that maybe it's people who actually get treatment who have ADHD is maybe only 10%. There's actually good treatment available for people, and we'll talk about some of the stuff that happened. One of the things that I want to emphasize is much like you can think of, this is clearly a condition that impacts your whole life. It is not something that you can say, I take a pill and just magically it kind of makes it better, or, I got to get a little more sleep. Have some people one time said, have you tried turning off notifications? And it wasn't, look, and that was, they were trying to be helpful, but fundamentally, their experience is not my experience, okay? And it's never going to be. So there's always going to be a challenge there, right? So, but the folks of us who deal with this, like, yeah, man, I turned all that shit off and I'm still freaked out, right? So, yeah. So there's, again, sort of 4 major areas. We get typically doing stuff with meds, and most of that falls into a couple different areas. Stimulants, and there's 2 stimulants, amphetamine and methylphenidate. I'm terrible with these. So these 2 things that are stimulants, and then there's a couple of things called SNRIs that are selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. There's also SSNRIs, which will do both serotonin and... Anyway, you'll see about it. Here's the point. These 2 medications and the primary first-line medications to treat ADHD are stimulants, and now atomoxetine, which is not a stimulant but an SNRI, has been chosen as a World Health Organization first-line treatment for ADHD. Both of them, those categories, the reason why they think they work, well, they don't really know why they work, okay? So let's just get over that first. But what they do know is that it increases levels of norepinephrine in the brain, in the central nervous system. And it appears that norepinephrine is related to a lot of things about taking action and things like that. So it increases levels of norepinephrine in the brain, and that, interestingly enough, inhibits, and this is something that I'm only sort of starting to learn about recently. The first paper I saw, I think, was in 2000, but a paper in 2016, I'm quoting here, found that when they gave about 300 kids methylphenidate, which is a known effective treatment for ADHD, just like amphetamine, which is Adderall, or other drugs like that. Gave them methylphenidate, and what they found is that these regions in the brain that are called the default mode network started quieting down. Now, what it is that, hey, I got to stand by the mic. The default mode network is a group of regions in the brain that are active when people are doing things like resting and daydreaming, kind of just hanging out, maybe letting their mind wander. In neurotypical people, when they start doing a task, those regions quiet down completely. With people with ADHD, they don't. They don't shut off when they're doing tasks. That means these other parts of their brain are active, going on, part of what's influencing your thinking and stuff like that. They found that when we give them that stuff, all of these regions of the brain start to quiet down. Again, they don't exactly know why it works, but that seems to be why these things help. For one reason or another, they quiet down these regions of the brain that are active normally with people with ADHD. So the other medications that they have, clonidine and, I always pronounce this wrong, let's just say these alpha agonists. And what they do is they lower activity of the adrenal nerve, which that tends to reduce the emotional dysregulation problems that people have. So people who have a lot of problems with like rejection sensitive dysphoria and things like that, clonidine, for example, that's something I take, and it is known to be particularly effective for folks who deal with that. So I also take a lot of supplements. I don't really want to get into it too much because I don't like to recommend things to people without a lot of context, and I'm not a doctor and I've made mistakes. So, but I take some things that help me. But in general, I think I could also do the same thing if I got a nutritionist and worked through that. I'm just terrible at food, and that's not what I do. So people with ADHD, especially those who are diagnosed as adults, they usually don't have a lot of education or information about how their brain works and how to make it work in in an environment where the way you do stuff isn't the way they do stuff. And so typically that falls into a couple different areas. Therapy, which would be seeing somebody like a licensed clinical social worker, and things like that. I found that really helpful. I also have looked at some kinds of coaching, which is often helpful for people with ADHD, but who are like feeling pretty okay about themselves, but they really need some help figuring out how to structure their lives better because we're basically given no information about it. And so there's good techniques that tend to work for people, but we tend to need sort of a coach to keep us on there, or we need other people to sort of be around to be with and do that. And so supportive social groups are a big part of that too. Feeling like you can talk about this stuff and they understand and get it. And that really makes a big difference. With finding a therapist, I don't know if I mentioned it later, but I have always found that a key thing for finding a therapist and also finding other folks is that you talk to somebody who has experience and probably specializes in ADHD, because a number of therapies, we're going to get into this later, a number of therapies that traditionally work well for people do not work well for people with ADHD. For example, typical therapy that sort of focuses on breaking down your thinking and cognitive behavior stuff, things like that, that is often ineffective for people with ADHD because their emotions come so fast they have a great deal of trouble actually separating the feeling from the decision to the action because it happens in a couple of seconds. You have that. You need help from people outside of you. Secondly, would be sensory environmental modification. So it's really filtering or altering sensory input. And so it's proven pretty well that if you do things like change your soundscape, like what you're listening to, you change what you're looking at, the kinds of light you're looking at, things like that, those things make significant differences in what your central nervous system is doing. Those feelings are very, very evident, I have found, for me, and I think for a lot of other people with ADHD, that sound, like the differences in sound, like I can't work in silence. I have to have a din of noise. But it has to be a din because it has to be something that sort of occupies part of my mind, but not enough to make it want to get really active. And you're kind of walking like on a fence like that all the time with this stuff, trying to find that place where it works for you. And so I've done things like, I get into the accessibility settings on Mac OS and like make it so it's black and white. And if you're a person, especially if you're dealing with a lot of anxiety and stuff, sometimes it can be shocking how like just changing the colors in your environment, changing colors you're looking at, dramatically can change how you can feel the difference in your central nervous system and what it's doing to your body. When you have emotional responses, I don't get into this too much, we have involuntary somatic reactions to those. That's the stuff that hurts. All of those reactions you feel in you when you feel that comes with the emotion, those are involuntary and those happen automatically and you can't stop them. So with folks with ADHD, those things tend to come harder and faster, and so it is like I am now dealing with a lot of pain stuff and later in life, and that's a major issue for me, and for a lot of reasons, but it seriously interferes with my ability to do things and get things done. And then there's assist systems. So those are things, some obvious stuff like any kind of assist system that helps you fill in stuff that you don't, like stuff you don't have to remember for yourself, you can let something else remember for you, that's an assist system, right? But there's other kind of assist systems. So there's like reminders and calendars, there's task tracking, but I want to talk about task tracking for a second. I think there's a, I don't know, I call it the quest log problem. If you play games much, I'm kind of betting there's a couple people play video games out here. Okay, nowadays, I can remember when you had to draw your own stupid maps. Nowadays, they draw the map for you where you've been, shows you everywhere you've been, shows what's your quest right now. It's probably on the screen and there's a target to go find it. And I can go click and I immediately see a quest log. I can see all the places that I did, all the things that I have to do, stuff like that. Video games got it right because they know that's information for executing tasks. You want that available to you as fast as possible. But the lack of that kind of stuff in my life, like I really need that stuff in the rest of my life too. Because yeah, I can play those video games pretty well and get into that, but what I often find is that I lose track of where I was, what I was doing, and especially when I've been having all this burnout stuff and a lot of memory issues that are associated with that, often associated with burnout. And I've been having a lot of that stuff. What I'll find is that I forget what I was doing, and then I have to like reconstruct it in my head because it's gone out of my short-term working memory. It is gone. Sometimes it just gets erased. I don't know why. Maybe it's a photon, maybe I didn't get ECC memory. That's all I know, a little joke for everybody. But yeah, so basically I think that's an interesting thing that I've been thinking about, and like how does that solve that problem? How can we apply that to people's lives? Anyway, I don't know. But I have thought that there's a lot of interesting possibilities with large language models. One of the things I thought about was I use a tool that takes screenshots and it only saves it on my computer. I'm not sending this shit to anybody else. But it takes a screenshot like every 15 seconds of what I'm doing. And I need that because of the quest log problem. I can't remember what I was doing. And so I have to go back and be like, shit, well, okay, yeah, I think that was it. Yeah, but what I could do with like an LLM was say, let's pass those through a text recognition, do OCR on it, and then basically have the LLM summarize like what I've been doing for like the past, every 15 minutes or something like that. That would be enormously helpful to me as a person with ADHD. Enormously helpful. I have tried to find the time to figure out how to do it myself, and I just have not, but that stuff is major stuff, and I think that LLMs are actually really interesting for helping people create personal knowledge assistance. And that's really, people with ADHD need that. We all need that. So one of the things that goes along a lot with anxiety, your ADHD is anxiety. And I got lots to go here. I know I've been talking a little bit, but what I found is that I can tell you a little bit about anxiety. I think most people have experience with it, feeling scared about things. This is probably the worst part of having ADHD for me, is just how bad my anxiety is. And I think I have ADHD, and then you kind of add in some special stuff. I think I have a tendency just to be, I have generalized anxiety disorder. I have a tendency to be more anxious than some. I also have these sensory processing issues. That tends to trigger anxiety a lot. Talked about some stuff there. One of the interesting things is anxiety is, being such a jerk. The fear circuit, sometimes called the CNS, those are the different systems that make up detecting danger and then doing things to you to tell you about the danger. So the fear circuit perceives danger, and it induces pain and discomfort in us to get us to alter our behavior. And so the message format it uses is pain. That is how it talks to you. Fear uses that discomfort and pain. It doesn't use JSON. I didn't choose to use that. That's how it communicates, by hurting you. And that sucks, right? And it especially sucks when it's like, wow, those emotions are really hard. Well, those reactions are going to be stronger. They're going to be more painful and less comfortable. And for a lot of people, anxiety is their primary motivator. And I find this very, very commonly with folks with ADHD. For me, it manifests as comparison and diminishing my self-worth. Constant shaming of myself and believing that I don't do things right. I learned to doubt my ability in almost everything and anticipate failure. I thought I had to prepare constantly for every possibility because I existed in a place where I constantly was fearing the future, and all I saw in the past was failure. All I saw were the mistakes I made. My self-worth was measured by my perceived acceptance from others. And external validation was really all I had. There wasn't anything inside of me that thought I was capable or worthy or good. Not really. Not if you asked me and you really went down to it, I would have said no to every question about that. But that's an untenable way to live. You cannot do that. And, so when stuff gets tough, in 2017, I felt pretty good about myself. I was doing these talks. I felt like people seemed to like what I was doing, and, that was really cool. And I had, a wife, kid at home. Things, I guess, were going okay, it seemed like. And then end of 2017, stuff was really bad. And my wife and I split up, and my kid was in we didn't know what was going to happen with him. He wasn't living with me, and he was kind of in some trouble and some danger. And it didn't resolve for 2 years until I knew he was going to be okay. And I was drifting and not doing so hot for a while, and then 2020 happened. And if you talk about that model you have in your head of the universe and what you think, how you think things will go, what you think you can expect. Well, if you disrupt enough of that model, it's just like, what else is wrong with it? And I think fundamentally it's very hard when you see something shift that much. Everybody gets an existential fear. But I've had existential fear my whole life, so it's kind of like, shit, that went into overdrive. And I really nosedived. I went hardcore into avoidance, doing all sorts of stuff probably should have been doing, treating myself like crap, and frankly, kind of treating some other people like crap too. And I'm not real proud of that. But that was how it was. In 2021, I started to kind of catch on what was going on, but that was when finally all the shit I did to my body, pushing myself through the anxiety and all the stuff that does to me, it finally broke my body. My back, my upper shoulder and my back, I did something to my shoulder and it turned my back into a big, hard bruise. Whole upper here, I couldn't move my neck, I couldn't move this arm without intense pain. Should have taken time off work, didn't. Pushed through, and kept pushing through the pain. That's what I did because that's all I knew to do. But I knew stuff was pretty messed up. I ended up spending a lot of time having to think about myself, how things felt to me. You know, when you're dealing with pain, you have to pay attention to your body because every single movement gets hard. I had to figure out what to do and to change my trajectory. And the biggest thing is I had to stop hating myself, you know, but it was the only thing I knew. I had a vile, and still do, vile and cruel inner voice. And I needed help to stop that, to learn some other way to do it. I couldn't do it on my own. And I talked about it, forced to listen to my body. And I really had to start to prioritize my health, investing time and researching how to help myself. And I realized, frankly, and this can be tough sometimes, I think, I don't want to make it a big thing about like, I'll turn it too negative, but nobody's going to care about it like I do. Basically what I found was, if I was okay with drifting, all of my doctors and all of my care team was fine with me just kind of drifting okay too. It doesn't mean they were trying to do something shitty, but I got to tell you, one of the big things I did was change everybody who I was working with. I fired a lot of people because and it's because I needed something different, and they weren't giving it to me. Good or bad, whatever, they weren't giving it to me. My perspective changed dramatically from I'm an anxious person. If you ever saw talks I did in 2016, 2017, I probably focused mainly on anxiety is the big thing I deal with. But really, I'm a person with an ADHD brain, and that's why all this stuff manifests. I learned that I have a disability, and that actually kind of took me a while to be like okay with saying. Even me, this guy who's been up here talking about this stuff for 10 years. Nope, that was hard. And I didn't ask for it. I wasn't lazy. I didn't just like suck so much at life, and I wasn't just born broken. No, I just have a little bit of a different brain. And I didn't ask for it. But I also had to accept that I was the only one who could help me. Like I said before, I had to do it. It's really my responsibility. Focusing on ADHD really changed my treatment patterns a lot. And so taking that on was stuff that I said I had to do and figure out what those were. And the keys for me were finding providers who understood ADHD and anxiety and trauma. The way that people deal with trauma, ADHD folks, you'll see patterns that are similar to a lot of folks who deal with PTSD. They think there's some similarities in terms of treating them too, especially in treating anxiety with ADHD folks, especially this really high running anxiety. But what I found was that many common approaches to breaking down thought patterns, behavior patterns, like I talked about, they're not effective with people with ADHD. And there's a lot of medical professionals I met out there who have a very simplistic understanding of it. They view it as an attention or just an attention disorder like that. And it is so reductive and misses so many things that they simply do not know how to actually give care to the patient. And that is my experience. And I've had it repeatedly. It doesn't mean they're bad, it just means they don't have any experience with it. I have a disability that's not going to get better. I'm an anxious person, and I have been since my first memories. That has not changed in almost 50 years, and it's not going to stop now. And there are more years behind me than there are in front of me, right? So I've been doing this a long time to myself. I need people to help me. I need that just because we're social creatures and we don't exist independently, right? But at the end of it, I'll leave you with this. The most important thing that you can do is love yourself without condition or qualification. You love yourself as you are right now. That's what works. That's what helps. I was cruel to myself for a long time. I accomplished a lot of things, but I didn't think any of them were worth a damn unless someone told me it was. And that puts your happiness and the nature of your existence in the hands of other people. And it's not easy and it's not simple. And it means doing something. I haven't done this before, and I'm like a baby trying to learn to walk, man. It's hard. I had to learn to love myself and to be kind to myself. And as I've learned to do that, things still hurt, but not quite as much and not quite as long. And things are still hard. They still suck sometimes, but I know they'll turn around. And that's a pretty big step for me. So thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. I don't know how much time we have left to do any